The Koran. For 1400 years, Muslims have sought to uncover the secrets concealed in its verses.
The Quran has several levels of meaning, and you discover them by constant reflection and by rendering the Quran into an open text.
Its words have inspired civilizations to greatness.
Islam spread within the first 100 years of its existence and created an empire greater than Rome at its zenith.
Yet some have found in the Quran the basis for a violent ideology.
There are many religious figures who are very emotional, who are interpreting the Quran in a manner which suggests confrontation and violence and death.
What then are the true meanings of the Quran?
They say that little knowledge is very dangerous. Just to know how to read the Quran is not enough to understand what the Quran is saying.
The Quran is the holy book of Islam. Over 1 billion Muslims worldwide believe it is the direct word of God as handed down to the Prophet Muhammad in the 7th century. Unlike the Bible, the Quran does not have a traditional narrative structure. Instead, it is made up of 114 chapters organized mostly by length. Some are pages long, others just a few phrases. According to Muslims, God revealed the verses of the Quran to Muhammad over the course of 22 years. Scholars compiled them into written form only after the Prophet's death. Deciphering the Quran's meaning, therefore, has long presented a challenge.
It doesn't tell the story of Islam, it doesn't tell the story of the Prophet Muhammad or the early Muslim community. It really doesn't tell any stories at all. The Quran is essentially God's dramatic monologue.
For a minority of Muslims in the 21st century, that monologue has been used to justify an extremist political philosophy and a violent strain of religious fundamentalism. Chapter 58, verse 5. Those who resist God and His messenger will be crumbled to dust, as were those before them. This is how many, both Muslim and non-Muslim alike, have come to view the Quran. But while the holy book does contain passages that call for violence, this complex and mysterious scripture also has plenty to say against it. Chapter 5, verse 2. Cooperate with one another on furthering good and virtue, and do not cooperate on furthering sin and aggression. For the vast majority of those who live by the Quran, these messages of peace and compassion are its true guiding principles.
For many Muslims, the Quran is the source book for life. In other words, it's not just a book that tells the Muslim about his or her relationship to the divine creator, but it's also a source book of moral guidance.
How can two worldviews, one of peace and one of violence, coexist within the same book?
Those who want to present a picture of Islam as a violent religion will focus on those few verses and say the violent thing, and the ones who want to say that Islam is all sweetness and light and toleration will pick the other half. Neither is, of course, entirely true.
These contradictions are in many ways the product of more than 1,400 years of culture and conflict. According to Muslims, in the year 610 AD, in the town of Mecca on the Arabian Peninsula, Muhammad ibn Abdullah was called to prophecy by God. The revelations Muhammad received would come to be known as the Quran. Many of these revelations envisioned a more just and equal society and were revolutionary in scope. As Muhammad began to preach, these messages quickly captivated the hearts and minds of people who had suffered generations of inequity and oppression.
We have to care for the poor. We have to care for the needy. We have to care for the impoverished, those who are disenfranchised and powerless. That is really the main thrust of Islamic social justice.
What had been a mix of warring tribes, each with its own set of gods, was soon unified by Muhammad under Islam's banner. Within a few decades, the Quran's message expanded across the entire peninsula. After Muhammad's death in 632, Muslim rulers or caliphs continued to spread the word of the Holy Book. Chapter 18, verse 29. And report to the people the truth from your Lord. Let him who wills believe in it, and let him who wills reject it.
The Quran tells Muslims to spread Islam, to spread the message of Islam. And rulers, in particular, interpreted the spread of Islam in an imperial fashion.
Within 50 years, what had begun as a small community of faith centered in Mecca and Medina had thoroughly absorbed most of the Indian subcontinent. It had swallowed whole most of North Africa, and it had pushed the Christian empire deep into Europe and made it very little more than just a regional power.
The Quran would inspire a series of empires. One of the first was the Abbasid Empire, centered in Baghdad. Founded in the year 750 AD, the Abbasid Empire marked the beginning of the golden age of Islam, a civilization built on the messages contained in the Quran. A pillar of this civilization was a concept repeatedly emphasized throughout the Holy Book, that of ilm, or knowledge.
The word ilm or knowledge is used more often in the Quran than any other word except the word for God. God emphasizes knowledge because that is what makes us human beings.
It is ilm, say many scholars, that inspired the empire's rulers and helped their civilizations flourish.
The Quran is like the seed, and it exploded, it inspired these dormant human beings in Arabia to become inquisitive about everything and explore everything.
The Abbasid Empire achieved unprecedented heights in science, math, and technology. Its scholars collected many ancient Greek texts that may have otherwise been lost, and later passed them back to the Europeans.
This was an era in which the great works of literature, the great works of philosophy, in particular Aristotle, were preserved not in Greek, but in Arabic. These great works that essentially become the foundation of Western civilization were translated not from Greek to Latin, but from Arabic to Latin.
The Quran also served as inspiration in the arenas of art and culture.
In Islamic art, for example, we find that there's a tremendous emphasis on calligraphy, that is, on the writing in a beautiful way of the Arabic script, particularly when it's Quranic verses. You know, the Quranic verses as decoration become almost emblematic of Islamic art.
Like Christian monks who first copied down the Bible, the calligraphers chosen to transcribe the Quran were held in high esteem, and it sometimes took years to create a complete copy of the holy text. As the word of the Quran spread under the Abbasid Empire, millions of people came to live their lives according to its messages. One of those dictates centers around a word that appears just a few times in the Quran's pages and is one of the most controversial and misunderstood: jihad.
The basic use of the word jihad is a struggle to be a good Muslim, a struggle to live by the codes of Islam. That is the original meaning of jihad.
Jihad translates as struggle. It is marked by two distinct forms, the lesser jihad and the greater. Greater jihad, a phrase first used by Muhammad himself, refers to the internal struggle to improve one's soul and become a better human being in the eyes of God. Greater jihad is given more prominence in Islamic tradition. But lesser jihad has historically garnered more attention and controversy.
The lower form of jihad is a physical jihad. When you are attacked, your family is attacked, your wife is attacked, your children are attacked, you must stand up and fight back.
Chapter 22, verse 39. Permission to take up arms is hereby granted to those who are attacked. They have suffered injustice. God has all the power to give them victory.
A good Muslim, if Islam is under siege or the community is under siege, has the right, indeed may have the obligation, to defend his faith or her faith, the community, or oneself.
The concept of jihad as battle would soon be cast in a new light for those who lived by the Quran. At the high point of the Abbasid Empire, armies from Christian Europe would go on the march, and a series of battles for the holy city of Jerusalem would begin. The Crusades. In the 10th and 11th centuries, from Spain to India, two holy books served as the spiritual guides for millions of people: the Bible and the Koran. Led by the Quran, Muslim leaders ruled over several vast empires, huge cities of wealth and culture, centers of knowledge and art. Christian Europe, however, was languishing in what were known as the Dark Ages. Still, the two faiths and their texts had much in common. Islam views the followers of Christianity and Judaism as fellow people of the book who believe in the same God. Chapter 2, verse 62. Surely those who believe, and those who are Jews and Christian, whoever believes in God and the last day, and does good, they shall have their reward from God. The Quran also contains many references to biblical figures. Chapter 57, verse 27. Then we followed up these messengers with Jesus, son of Mary, to whom we gave the gospel, and we put in the hearts of his followers kindness and mercy. But in the Muslim world, European culture was not held in very high regard.
The Muslims had had a very clear idea of what the peoples of Northern Europe were like. They were of the wrong religion, they were boorish, they were unhygienic, they were like lumbering animals.
These two worlds were about to come into bloody conflict over one of the most sacred places on earth, Jerusalem, a city holy to Christians, Jews, and Muslims. After Mecca and Medina, the third most sacred city in Islam is Jerusalem. There, the Dome of the Rock marks the site where tradition holds Muhammad ascended to heaven. For centuries after the death of the Prophet in 632 AD, Jerusalem was ruled by Arab Muslims who had spread the message of the Quran throughout the region. Then, near the end of the 11th century, Turkish Muslims took control of the city.
The Turks are not Arabs. They're a separate ethnic group, but they're Muslims. Then they moved down south through Syria and in 1077 conquered Jerusalem from the Arabs.
The Turkish Empire was also expanding west and soon posed a direct threat to Christian Europe. The Byzantine Church, situated near the edge of the Turkish Empire, was the first to feel the pressure. In 1095, Byzantium made an urgent request for assistance from fellow Christians in Rome.
The Byzantine Emperor sent a message to the Pope in Europe saying that he needed help to defend his frontiers against the incursions of the Turks who were coming ever closer to Constantinople, his capital.
Pope Urban II agreed to the military assistance and appealed to powerful knights throughout Europe to go and fight. To motivate them, Pope Urban framed the conflict as a battle between the faiths and their sacred texts.
Urbanus packages this together with an appeal not only just to push the Turks out of Asia Minor, but to continue on and push the Turks completely out of the regions that they had taken, including Syria, but most importantly, Jerusalem.
In 1096, the First Crusade was launched. More than 50,000 Christian peasants and some 7,000 knights set forth from Europe on a march toward the Holy Land. After a punishing 3-year journey, they reached the hills overlooking Jerusalem and laid siege to the city. The siege lasted a month, during which more than 1,000 crusaders died from both combat and disease. Then, on July 15th, 1099, the Christians broke through the walls that surrounded Jerusalem and poured into the city.
There was no love lost between these people. The Crusaders, who had now been for 3 years on the road to get to this place, and who had spent many weeks now outside of Jerusalem thinking they were about to die. And when they went in there, it was a pretty brutal sack of the city.
There is no doubt on both sides of the historiography for this event that the Crusaders were exceptionally bloodthirsty. The memory of the brutality of the Crusaders is still with Muslims today.
In the aftermath of what was a devastating defeat, many looked to the Quran for answers.
Immediately after the coming of the First Crusade, religious scholars were assembling and saying to themselves, reading the holy text, "What have we done wrong? Why have we incurred God's displeasure?"
In the Quran, one concept proved to be key as Muslims tried to understand how they had lost one of their holiest cities and how they might be able to win it back. They turned to jihad, or struggle, and laid the groundwork for their own holy war.
Islam at that point did not have any equivalent of the holy war. This is how the very word jihad changed its meaning as a result of the Crusades.
But Muslims would not launch their holy war until nearly a century later, with the rise of two warriors who would use jihad as their rallying cry. Nur ad-Din was a powerful leader who, in 1146, took control of parts of what are now Syria and Jordan. A deeply religious man, he immersed himself in the study of the Quran.
Everywhere he went, he took with him religious scholars, Quran readers, mystics, inspiring the troops, reading out relevant verses of the Quran to do with jihad.
Chapter 9, verse 14. Fight them. God will chastise them at your hands, and he will lay them low and give you victory over them. For Nur ad-Din, these passages were taken as a call to arms to win back Jerusalem. Nur ad-Din's interpretation of jihad resonated with his subjects who were eager to defeat the Europeans. When a second Crusader army, launched from Europe in 1145, reached the lands controlled by Nur ad-Din, it was roundly defeated. Nur ad-Din's victories were an inspiration to those around him, including his deputy, a young warrior who was also a devout student of the Quran, his name Saladin.
He worked really for the spiritual rebirth of the region. And so he was a very religious man. One of his friends said that he thought of God and also the jihad all the time. And if you weren't talking to him about that, he didn't want to talk to you.
In 1174, as momentum was building towards an all-out assault to recapture Jerusalem, Nur ad-Din died. The reins of power were taken over by Saladin, who began making plans for his attack on the Holy City. But first, Saladin would have to face the Crusaders in a bloody and decisive battle outside Jerusalem. On a dry mountain plateau, under a parching desert sun, Saladin and his troops would be comforted by verses from the Koran as they prepared to meet the enemy. July 4th, 1187. Sunrise on the Hattin Plateau, a barren expanse of desert 70 miles from the city of Jerusalem. Muslim soldiers were preparing to attack an encampment of Christian crusaders. To inspire his men, the commander, Saladin, ordered a religious advisor to read passages from the Quran. Chapter 3, verse 195. As for those who forsake the domain of evil and are driven from their homeland and fight for it and are slain, I shall most certainly efface their bad deeds and bring them into gardens where running waters flow as a reward from God. At this point in history, for the first time, handheld Qurans allowed Muslims to keep the word of God with them at all times. Because the Quran began as an oral scripture, each village had its own hafiz, or one who memorized the holy book. In time, these villages began transcribing Qurans for individual use.
The small pocket Qurans that came in the 11th century were on paper, and they made the holy text accessible to ordinary people. They could put it in their pocket, close to their flesh, so to speak, to feel that it was acting as a kind of protection from God.
The night before the assault, the Muslims set the grass around the Crusader camp aflame. By dawn, the Crusaders were enveloped in choking smoke. As the sun began to rise over the battlefield, the Muslims attacked. After half a day of fierce battle, the Crusader army lay devastated. Emboldened by his victory, Saladin turned his eye to reclaiming Jerusalem. Within 3 months, Saladin's army had advanced to the gates of the holy city and surrounded it. After a 12-day siege, the vastly outnumbered Christian forces surrendered. Saladin now faced a choice: what to do with the thousands of captives under his command.
He was persuaded by his advisors that here was an opportunity to show mercy, to show the superiority of Islam as a religion over Christianity.
Saladin decided to accept the surrender of the Christian commander. He then released all the prisoners unharmed.
He allows those who can ransom themselves to go, and then when those people who cannot afford to pay ransom, he allows them to go and pays for them by his own estate. Now, this kind of action is only possible if you're inspired by the Quran, as is Salahuddin.
The loss of Jerusalem was a bitter defeat for the Christians in Europe, and the fall of the city quickly triggered another crusade to win it back. This third crusade, launched in 1189, was led by Richard the Lionhearted, the King of England. Like Saladin, Richard was known for his devotion to his faith and his bravery in battle. The two warriors were worthy opponents.
Richard would have heard about Saladin and his reputation even before he set out from his home in Europe to the Holy Land. Saladin had been much praised and feared.
Richard's early battles with Saladin's forces led to decisive Christian victories. But taking Jerusalem would prove far more difficult. Saladin's armies were strong, and the open land around the walled city made it difficult to mount an attack. The Muslims and Christians were at a stalemate. On September 2nd, 1192, both sides agreed to a truce.
The Third Crusade is a bit of an anticlimax from the Muslim point of view. Saladin failed to remove the Crusaders permanently from Muslim soil.
Both Christians and Muslims had fought hard in the name of their holy books. Yet because neither side had won a decisive victory, the battles they had waged for more than 100 years would remain unresolved. And centuries later, those wounds would be reopened by the approaching clash between Islam and modernity. When it came, two Muslim scholars would help lay the groundwork for a new age of Islam, one that would advocate a new view of the Quran and what it says about jihad. According to Muslim belief, in the 7th century AD, the verses of the Quran were revealed by God to the Prophet Muhammad. These revelations spawned a new religion and launched a succession of powerful empires.
The Quran was sort of the engine. It's just a phenomenal unleashing of intellectual and religious energies that really informs the culture and the society at the time.
What became known as the Golden Age of Islam lasted hundreds of years, but by the 15th century, the decline had begun. Internally, the resources of the various Muslim empires were stretched thin, and they began competing with each other for land and influence. According to some scholars, this infighting was due in part to society turning away from the Quran's injunctions to seek knowledge, or ilm, and focusing instead on the raw pursuit of power.
The downfall begins in the 15th, 16th centuries when ilm or knowledge is no longer prized. So you have Muslim empires fighting other Muslim empires, and there's tyranny and there's oppression, and the scholar is being more and more marginalized.
Of equal importance to the decline of the empires were external forces, in particular, the growing power of Christian Europe. The last of the great Muslim empires was that of the Ottomans. Centered in Turkey, the Ottoman Empire began its rise in the 15th century and eventually spread as far as the gates of Vienna. It was here, in 1683, that European forces decisively halted Muslim expansion. For 2 months, more than 200,000 soldiers battled outside the city walls. In the end, the Ottoman army was defeated. From this point on, Muslim influence lost more and more ground to the powers of Europe. With a central political authority no longer in place, variant interpretations of Islam spread throughout the Muslim world. In response, a movement would arise that sought to restore Islam to its former glory and to a literal reading of the Quran. In the mid-18th century, a scholar named Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab lived in the declining Ottoman Empire in what is today Saudi Arabia. He came to believe that Muslims had strayed from the teachings of the Quran, and he advocated a return to what he claimed were the fundamentals of his religion.
He saw his society as becoming corrupt, so like, quote, any good revivalist, the notion is, if we're corrupt, it means we've departed from true religion, we need to get back to true religion. And for Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, that meant going right back to the Quran and to the example of the Prophet.
Wahhab believed that all non-orthodox interpretations of the Quran should be banned. He called for such things as the stoning of adulterers and the amputation of the hands of thieves, rules spelled out in the Holy Book, though not always applied.
The Quranic literalists don't see that this was something that was written in the early medieval period or the late ancient period. It's one thing to have it written in the Quran and another thing to implement it.
Wahhab's strict interpretation of the Quran might have remained his own, but for a fateful meeting. In 1744, while traveling across the Arabian Peninsula, Wahhab met a local leader named Muhammad ibn Saud. Saud was an ambitious chieftain bent on unifying all of Arabia. Armed with Wahhab's fundamentalist teachings, Saud believed he could use both a sword of steel and a sword of faith to subdue the peninsula.
They actually literally signed a compact. You will be the religious leader and I will be the political leader, and we will try and take the whole peninsula.
It would take nearly 2 centuries, but in 1924, descendants of Saud finally conquered Arabia. They now controlled Islam's holiest cities, Mecca and Medina. 8 years later, the modern state of Saudi Arabia was established, and the stringent doctrines of Wahhabism became the law of the kingdom. But it was not Wahhab who would create a fundamentalist doctrine for the modern age. That task was taken up by an Egyptian journalist who built on Wahhab's philosophy to create his own interpretation of the Quran, one grounded in violence and steeped in controversy. His name, Sayyid Qutb. 1918, the end of World War I spelled the final collapse of the faltering Ottoman Empire. Across the Middle East, Arab lands were divided up between European colonial powers, which established secular and often oppressive regimes. This was the world in which Sayyid Qutb, born in Egypt in 1906, grew up. As a young man, Qutb was neither radical nor religious. A journalist and a scholar, his work took him to America in 1948. There, he was shocked by what he saw as a decadent society, and his radicalization began.
When he came to the United States, he was largely secular. So I guess one has to believe him that what freaked him out about the United States were 2 things. One was the segregation and the racist laws which were still in force. The second thing was women. He was totally taken aback by the freedom with which women transported themselves. This came as a big shock to him.
When Qutb returned to Egypt, he joined the Muslim Brotherhood, a political organization that opposed British colonialism and advocated a return to the time when the Quran was the law of the land. Qutb's transformation accelerated when, in 1954, Egyptian President Nasser began a crackdown on the Muslim Brotherhood. Qutb was arrested and put in jail.
It was really in the dank and sadistic prisons of Nasser's Egypt that Qutb, who was repeatedly tortured, who saw so many of his fellow Muslim brothers tortured and murdered, that this radical reinterpretation of the Quran took hold of him, where he no longer believed that preaching and living a good moral Muslim life was enough to change Muslim and Arab society, that it required a revolution.
His interpretation of Islam became an interpretation of Islam under siege and of Muslims under siege.
In prison, Qutb wrote 2 of his most important works, a commentary on the Quran and an incendiary political manifesto titled Milestones. Like Wahhab, He argued that the Quran alone was the source of knowledge and the guide to daily life. Qutb believed that only by returning to the, quote, true faith could Islam be saved. Qutb also found in the Quran the justification for armed struggle against those who stood in the way.
What Sayyid Qutb did is to go to the scriptures and, in effect, say, look at the scriptures, look at those sectors of the scriptures that talk about what do you do when you're under siege, what do you do when it's a war between belief and unbelief, and he used those texts to legitimate what he was doing.
His argument is that the world has changed and that the Muslim governments are no longer properly defending the world of Islam against incursions from outside. And so, he argues, each individual Muslim must now take the responsibility of military jihad on their own shoulders.
Throughout the 1960s, Qutb's writings struck a chord with many Muslims in the Middle East who had suffered for years under colonial rule. Qutb reinforced a growing sentiment that colonial rule was the equivalent of a new crusade.
That ideology proved to be an inspiration. And so Qutb is both an inspiration to mainstream, if you will, Muslims and Islamic activists, as well as to a whole variety of extremists that developed. This runs right down to people like Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda.
The legacy handed down by Wahhab and Qutb to Muslim extremists in the decades to follow would cause many, Muslim and non-Muslim alike, to take a closer look at the Quran, triggering a debate about the true meaning of its mysterious verses. For more than 14 centuries, the Quran has been a source of guidance for Muslims around the world. But what believers find in its pages has often depended on what they are looking for. Like nearly all holy books, the Quran contains a host of meanings that are sometimes contradictory and difficult to reconcile. There are numerous verses that call on believers to live peacefully and to create a society built on justice and understanding. Chapter 16, verse 90. Behold, God enjoins justice and the doing of good and generosity toward one's fellow men, and he forbids all that is shameful and all that runs counter to reason. But other verses in the Quran command Muslims to rise up in arms against non-believers. Chapter 9, verse 29. Fight those who believe not in God, nor acknowledge the religion of truth, until they pay with willing submission and feel themselves subdued. In recent years, a relatively small but growing percentage of Muslims have found in verses such as these the justification for a violent ideology.
There is, in a very real way, a struggle for the soul of Islam between a majority and a minority. A minority that is a minority, but that is dangerous and have an impact beyond its numbers.
In 1998, Osama bin Laden quoted one of these verses. Fight and slay the pagans wherever you find them, seize them and take them captive, and lie in wait for them in every stratagem of war.
Osama bin Laden quoted from the Quran and also the example of the Prophet in order to try to justify his actions and the actions of these other radical leaders in pursuing their form of jihad.
But Muslim and non-Muslim scholars alike point out that bin Laden's use of the Quran is selective and distorted.
What's interesting is that when we go back and look at the verses of the Quran that bin Laden quotes, he plays with them in a way to make them seem more military than in fact they are. He quotes one verse that talks about the need to fight and kill the unbelievers. And that's where he stops. But the verse continues.
It also says, but when the enemy ceases to be a threat, when it ceases to fight, then remember that God is merciful, remember that, warfare is not the primary way that you should go.
Scholars argue that this type of distortion is common among radical Muslims, who insist there was once a time when followers of the Quran accepted a single interpretation of its words and lived by that interpretation.
This conception that there was this one version of Islam that we can go back to before it was fractured and separated into these competing versions of Islam is simply untrue. It never existed. From the very first moment in which the Prophet Muhammad revealed the very first words of the Quran, it was absorbed and understood and interpreted in wildly different ways by a whole host of different people within the community.
Whether the Quran should be used to condone acts of terror goes to the heart of the crisis within Islam today. The roots of that crisis can be found in the struggle that nearly all other great religions have faced: how to maintain the status of their sacred text in a modern world that seems to deny its relevance.
Islam and Muslims are going through a period analogous to what other faiths have gone through, Judaism and Christianity. And Muslims have been struggling with this since the late 19th century, the relationship of tradition to modernity or post-modernity. What's the relationship of a religious tradition to today?
Fundamentalism is a reaction to modernism. It's a reaction to change. Change is inevitable, and as long as change is inevitable, fundamentalism will be inevitable.
It's also inevitable that believers look to the Quran for answers about the future.
The Quran has been used to divine the future, but it does not itself pretend to hold the secrets of the future. Ultimately, the future that the Quran is concerned about is the end of time.
Still, that has not prevented some from claiming to find in its pages specific forecasts. One Muslim man, pointing to Quranic verses that refer to a great deluge, predicts that a powerful tsunami will strike the United States in 2007 as punishment for crimes against humanity. But most scholars discount these kinds of prophecies as yet another distorted reading of the text.
So there's all kinds of different ways of interpreting it, interpreting what the meaning is of the text. So really the difficulty is not what the text says, but what do we want to make it mean?
For centuries, through times of war and peace, the Quran has helped shape human history. The messages in Islam's holy book have been used to launch some of the world's greatest civilizations. And they have been cited as inspiration for acts of barbarism.
Muslims respect the Quran, they're motivated by the Quran. The challenge for Muslims is go to the Muslims and confront them like a mirror, hold that mirror up to them and say, where is this coming from? Is this coming from the Quran, or are the messages of peace, of compassion, of friendship, of knowledge stronger in the Quran? And if we can get it right, then we will be able to change the very nature of Muslim society in the 21st century.
Because of widespread literacy, because of widespread access to the Quran, Muslim individuals, and particularly Muslim women, are going to the Quran by themselves, for themselves, many for the first time. They are creating an Islam that is becoming ever more diverse, that is becoming the exact opposite of what these jihadists and these extremists want it to be.
How the Quran will continue to influence the events of history depends on how the millions of believers around the world interpret its words and how they choose to live by their holy book.